Hi guys, and welcome to our next episode for DCUSH. So today we're going to be looking at the Civil Rights Movement, but a particular part of the Civil Rights Movement, and that is Black Power. Okay, so you want to make sure that you please make sure that you've looked at the resources for the Civil Rights Movement. I'm talking like SNCC and Martin Luther King and the NAACP. That's all been before this. And then once you're ready, you can do this mini lesson. So let's get started. Alright, so what we're going to be looking at here in this mini lesson is we're going to be looking at the shift from civil rights to black power after the death of Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, and we're also kind of here looking at also the aims and methods of civil rights organizations and individuals. Alrighty, so here's our essential questions for this lesson. By what measurement will civil rights declared to be successful? Okay, so like what's the standard in which we know like we've made it? And then how does violent or nonviolent protest work together to achieve certain aims? Okay. Alrighty, so let's talk about kind of the state of things after the Civil Rights Movement. Okay, so as a bit of a review here, in 1964, okay, the Civil Rights Act, and then in 1965, there's two kind of monumental moments for Black Americans. Okay, so the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and then 1965, the Voting Rights Act does two things. Okay, all citizens, no matter your race, can vote, and then secondly, all of the kind of like Jim Crow landscape that had been set up since the end of the Civil War disappeared. Okay, so the whole like separate but equal was really at that point completely thrown out, not just in schools as it was under Browns versus Board of Education. Okay, so the thing you want to make sure that you understand is that even though the Civil Rights Movement had happened, Black Americans' lives hadn't really changed like too drastically on the ground, meaning like economic, political, socially, like there's still struggle and there's a lack of opportunity. Because again, like, okay, great, like I've earned the right to vote now, and I can, for example, like if I'm living in Alabama, I can drink the same, water fountain or go to the same bathroom as a white person, but I'm still poor and black and living in this, like red-lined, block-busted community. And that's really, really tough. Okay, and so what basically happens is the Civil Rights Movement, as it says here, shifts from focus upon the rural South to urban cities nationwide, as well as fractures into local organizations. And this is kind of an important thing here, because if you think about where most African Americans are living in the 1960s, it's in urban areas. 70% of African Americans are in metropolitan areas by that year. So how does this kind of change things? Well, with blacks still not like on the ground enjoying kind of the quote-unquote American dream that they had wanted, and with most of the movement kind of now shifting to urban cities, the cry for people becomes much different than it had under MLK's kind of like early kind of start of the Civil Rights Movement. So the rallying cry becomes Black Power, a push for black nationalism and militancy. And this is, if you may remember the guy Marcus Garvey, who way back in like the 1910s, 1920s, that we looked at a long time ago, was calling for this kind of like more kind of like aggressive kind of blackness. Okay. So here, the change is it's going to be more violent, and blacks are going to be proactive rather than a reactive kind of like MLK. Because if you think about it, Martin Luther King was responding to certain things on the ground that he saw as a problem. This is going to kind of take the focus and shift it towards blacks fighting for their rights more actively, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but definitely here it's going to take some forms that really people hadn't seen before. Okay, so let's talk about an example here. Okay, so SNCC. You may remember SNCC from the activity that we just did here a few minutes ago, if you are in the block in which we did this lesson. But SNCC was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Okay, so this is the thing that like college students, many of them had joined, and then would use that to organize, like some very famous sit-ins at like Woolworth counters, or other places on college or near college campuses. Okay, so after MLK has really done his thing, in 1966, a new graduate student, his name is Stokely Carmichael, it's this guy right here, okay, he takes charge of SNCC, and he radically changes what SNCC is going to be about. He makes black separatism the official objective of SNCC and kicks all white members out of it. Okay, so that really kind of shows you that, like, wow, SNCC is going in a completely different direction. And now, still, please notice, the nonviolent part is there. But then things get even more incendiary because his successor, by the name, which is so cool, H. Rap Brown, in 1967 was even more, as it says here, incendiary. And he's like, there's a very famous quote that he said. It says, like, if you want civil rights, paraphrasing there, get some guns and kill the honkies. It's like, whoa. So now the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is violent. Now Carmichael himself will actually go on to join the Black Panther Party. If you're not familiar with the Black Panther Party, it's not around today. It did last actually for many years after the 1970s and even on further from that point, but it is an urban armed revolutionary group. They're really interesting, and if you get some time to get some time just basically to go and Google and research, I highly recommend kind of checking out the Black Panthers, and you'll kind of see like a lot of kind of commonalities here with what we're discussing. Okay, there is one person we have to talk about, and that is Malcolm X. Okay, if you've not heard of Malcolm X, sometimes he's kind of like put next to MLK as like an alternative vision of what black civil rights can be, but I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Early on, okay, Malcolm X is definitely probably the most articulate spokesman for black power and violent separatism, okay? The reason why, by the way, he takes the name Malcolm X was he was actually born Malcolm Little, but he says, like, well, I don't know my last name because it was taken from me because I, was a slave and I was, renamed, essentially. Okay. Now, eventually what happens to him is he grows up in kind of like a black urban ghetto. He kind of has some issues and dealings with narcotics. He converts to Islam, and then he's actually assassinated by a rival faction of Muslims in 1965. Now, if you think about the timing there, pretty much same time as MLK. But the thing that, like, most people misunderstand about Malcolm X is that, yes, like, he was early on in his time, like right up until almost like the last year, he's a pretty strong advocate for violent separatism from white culture, kind of like Garvey in a sense. However, what's really unfortunate about his killing, just as it is unfortunate about MLK's, is that like in the last year of his life or so, he had just started to preach like a very like biracial message of positive inclusion and change, and he had abandoned, as it says there, like a lot of his like prior anti-white rhetoric. So like his loss on top of Martin Luther King and then also like Robert Kennedy and a few others was really, really devastating for kind of the civil rights movement. Okay. Now, there is a really important point here, is that when we're thinking about like what Black Power wants and kind of like looking at it, it's important that we kind of take a step back and we kind of think about like, okay, so like what does this all mean, or was it like actually as a significant thing as we kind of give it the credibility and attention that it was? So prevalence, let's evaluate it on that sense. Did Black Power define the post-civil rights movement? So something to note here, Black Power never attracted more than like a small minority, and to give you an actual number here, only roughly about 15% of blacks, historians have kind of deduced, labeled themselves separatist. But the problem is that this 15% was incredibly visible because they got a lot of publicity. Obviously, like people like, Malcolm X, like gathered a lot of attention. So okay, maybe Black Power did define like a kind of important note, but maybe not like all of it, with the kind of the post-civil rights movement. Effectiveness, did the Black Power movement matter? How? I definitely think here we can probably say that this is true, especially racial pride motivated blacks to take pride in heritage and appreciate their African roots. And there's one other kind of big thing here with this too, and that it says that Black Power advocates forced MLK and other leaders to focus on inner city blacks. Okay, and this is kind of like the point of this whole thing, is that Black Power is like access and having like, you know, the choice to go to good schools or to go to the same kind of like services and those kind of things are fine, but we need opportunity, we need housing, good jobs, like that kind of equality. And it really kind of focused MLK and other black leaders to start to work on those things. And to kind of like give you an example of that, MLK, when he dies, is actually in Tennessee, and he had just attended basically a meeting for these sanitation workers there in a local town, and like it was for equal, you know, wages and those kind of things. It wasn't for voting. So again, kind of showing you that Black Power did have kind of that impact. Now, I would tell you, definitely Google like Black Power artwork, or like look at like African-centered artwork like on Google, and you will definitely see that Black Power has had this kind of like this really, really positive emphasis in having like blacks and or like African artists take pride in blackness and express that through their artwork, and it's really, really cool. And I would definitely tell you as well, if we looked here at effectiveness and like compare that to Black Lives Matter today, we would see some kind of connections here with Black Power, and I think we could probably say that Black Lives Matter wouldn't have existed without this kind of like extension on to the civil rights movement. Alrighty, so that's the end of this mini lesson. Hope it was helpful in kind of looking at that post kind of civil rights landscape, and until next time, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.